For 4 long weeks, I lived in darkness. Not the kind of darkness you meet when you close your eyes at night. No. This was the kind that steals your world, steals your pride, steals your peace. I thought blindness had taken everything from me, but I was wrong. Because in that darkness, I placed my trust in my only son. I signed papers I couldn't read. I swallowed lies I couldn't challenge. And while the community called him a dutiful son, what I couldn't see with my eyes, I began to feel in my spirit. But then, my sight returned. Quietly. Secretly. And instead of celebrating, I pretended. I watched. I listened. And what I saw in those days broke me more than blindness ever could. Before we go deeper into this story of betrayal, family, and legacy, tell me where you're watching from right now. Let me know in the comments below. John's house wasn't just wood and stone, it was a monument to every sacrifice he'd ever made. A tall, proud black man in his late 60s, John had clawed his way up from nothing, through decades of hard labor and battles with a world that often seemed set against him. The home he built stood at the center of his neighborhood, a landmark that whispered his story: resilience, integrity, and survival. He had once shared that house with his wife, a woman of faith and kindness, whose absence still echoed through the halls. The smell of her cooking, the sound of her laughter, the prayers whispered in the kitchen before Sunday service, those memories lived in every room. Her death had left a hollow in John's heart that not even time could fill. Now the only piece of her he had left was Edward, their son. John loved him fiercely, but that love was fragile. Edward had grown up in his father's shadow, restless and impatient, chasing shortcuts where his father had preached discipline. Still, blood was blood. John believed that when his time came, this house would pass to Edward, not just as property, but as a symbol of the family's name, their dignity, their legacy. But as we'll soon see, Edward didn't see the house as legacy. He saw it as leverage. I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And tell me this: if you had one thing in your family you considered your true legacy, what would it be? Share it in the comments, I'd love to know. Edward had always carried himself with a certain charm, the kind that could light up a room and disarm suspicion. He smiled easily, spoke smoothly, and carried an air of confidence that made people believe him even when they shouldn't. That evening he came to his father with papers in hand. "Dad," he said softly, "these are just some medical documents, routine. The doctors need them signed so they can release the treatments and manage things smoothly. It's nothing complicated." John, weary from the stress of his failing eyesight and the constant hum of worry, leaned back in his chair. His hand traced the armrest, his eyes cloudy with the shadows of his condition. He trusted Edward, he wanted to trust Edward. After all, wasn't he the only family he had left? The pen scratched against the paper, sealing the first crack in the foundation of his legacy. But Edward's confidence that day was born not of love, but of desperation. For behind his polished smile stood another figure, Bank Manager Carter. A man who thrived in the shadows, opportunistic, calculating. Together, they had devised a scheme that leaned not only on John's vulnerability, but on Edward's hunger for quick success. And though John didn't know it yet, this signature wasn't for medicine. It was for something far more dangerous. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday drive. John, steady at the wheel, heading home from church where he had just spoken about faith and resilience. But fate has a way of turning in a single heartbeat. The screech of tires. The violent crash of metal against metal. Glass shattering into 1,000 stars. When the dust settled, John was alive, but his world was cloaked in darkness. The doctors called it temporary blindness, a condition that might heal in time or might not. For weeks they said. Maybe longer. The news rippled through the community. Church members brought casseroles and prayers. Old friends came by, their voices laced with pity and hope. And through it all, Edward was there, front and center. To the neighbors he was the picture of a dutiful son. He answered phone calls, balanced the checkbook, spoke firmly with the doctors, and told the church elders, "Don't worry. I'll take care of everything." They praised him. They said, "John raised a good boy." They clapped him on the back and called him responsible. But behind closed doors, Edward's eyes lingered on the family estate, the polished oak floors, the rows of land stretching far behind the house, the vault of his father's legacy. And for the first time, the son who had lived in his father's shadow saw an opportunity. The house grew quieter after nightfall, but Edward's footsteps were restless. While John slept in his darkened room, unaware of the world beyond the veil of blindness, Edward was wide awake. Papers shuffled. Phone calls whispered. Car lights flashed briefly in the driveway as Bank Manager Carter slipped in under the cover of night. The two men hunched over documents, their voices low but urgent, their laughter sharp like broken glass. It started small, an acre of land here, a vehicle there. Edward told himself it was temporary, that no one would ever know. The bank was willing to front him money, and Carter was happy to adjust the paperwork. But like all things born of desperation, the taste of easy cash only made Edward hungrier. Meanwhile, the community noticed. A deacon saw strangers surveying John's property. A neighbor overheard Edward bragging about new business ventures. Even the church ladies whispered after Sunday service, their voices trembling with unease. But when they pulled John aside, offering gentle warnings, he smiled with weary patience. "My boy has stepped up," he said, his blind eyes soft with trust. "He wouldn't do me wrong." Trust, his greatest strength and his deepest flaw. Whispers began to float through the pews on Sunday mornings. They started small, like a faint draft no one could quite place. But soon they swelled into full-blown rumors. Edward was selling things, taking loans, making deals that didn't sit right with the community. One evening, Elder Marcus, a man who had known John since they were boys, stopped by the house. His voice was heavy with concern. "Brother John," he said, resting a hand on his friend's shoulder, "I don't know how else to tell you this. Something ain't right with Edward's dealings. You need to be careful." John sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He wanted to believe Marcus. He wanted to listen. But before he could respond, Edward stepped into the room, his tone sharp but wrapped in practiced calm. "Dad," he said, pulling up a chair, "these folks don't understand. They see you vulnerable and now everybody wants to stir fear. They don't care about you like I do. They just want a piece of what you've built." The words stung John's ears, half warning, half comfort. Blindness had forced him to lean on Edward for everything, and though the doubts pricked at his heart, he silenced them. For now. Elder Marcus left that night with his jaw tight, muttering under his breath, "A man can lose his sight, but God help him if he loses his discernment." "Tell me, if you were Elder Marcus, would you push harder and expose Edward right then, or would you step back out of respect for John's trust? Comment below, I want to see how you'd handle it." The storm Edward had invited into the house was no longer whispering, it was pounding at the door. Phone calls came at odd hours. Creditors with sharp voices demanded payment. Letters with red stamps piled up, though Edward always snatched them away before John could reach the mailbox. At first, Edward managed with smooth excuses and small payments. But the loans were larger than he had admitted, even to himself. The bank, no longer patient, sent Carter to remind him of deadlines. Carter's words were like daggers, his smile colder than the marble floors of the bank lobby. "You promised results," Carter hissed one evening. "If your father won't sign the next agreement, Edward will take everything. The land, the house, all of it." But in the daylight, Edward played the devoted son. He moved gently around John's chair, steadying his father's hand, guiding him through the house. "Don't you worry, Dad," he'd say with a warmth that masked the dread in his eyes. "Everything's under control." John, blind and weary, clung to those words like a lifeline. He could not see the sweat on Edward's brow, nor the cracks spreading through his son's calm facade. The storm was growing, and it was only a matter of time before it crashed through the walls. It happened in fragments. First, a faint glimmer of light through the haze. Then shadows shifting where before there had been nothing. Day by day, John's world began to sharpen again. The doctor's predictions had been cautious, but healing came like a slow sunrise, quiet, steady, undeniable. But John told no one. Not even Edward. Especially not Edward. He moved through the house as if still blind, counting steps, touching the walls, letting his son guide him. But behind the veil of pretense, his eyes were wide open. He studied the clutter of envelopes stacked on the desk. He noticed Carter's visits, the way Edward's voice dropped into nervous whispers when the bank man appeared. From the kitchen doorway, John watched his son pace the floor, phone pressed to his ear, muttering promises he could not keep. The suspicion that once felt like betrayal from friends and neighbors now stirred inside John's own heart. And though it pained him, he could not deny the truth blooming before his eyes. For the first time, John wasn't just a father in the dark. He was a man with sight, carrying the weight of a secret, and waiting for the right moment to act. Have you ever kept quiet just to see how people would act when they thought you couldn't see them? Share your experience in the comments. I bet some of you know exactly what John is feeling right now. The nights grew longer, heavier with secrets. John, feigning blindness, sat quietly in his chair while the house shifted around him. But when the clock struck midnight and Edward thought his father asleep, John became the watcher. One night, voices rose from the study. He edged closer, moving with the silence of a man who had learned to live in shadows. "Carter, you promised?" Edward's voice cracked, desperate and furious. "I just need more time. He'll sign the last document soon. After that, everything will be ours." Carter's tone was colder, clipped with impatience. "You're running out of rope, Edward. The bank won't wait forever. Either he signs or the house goes. And believe me, I don't care which." John's chest tightened. His son's words cut deeper than the accident that had blinded him. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't suspicion. It was betrayal laid bare. He stepped back into the darkness of the hallway, his mind racing. From that night forward, John began collecting what little evidence he could: copies of letters, overheard conversations, the faint memory of each document Edward pushed under his hand. The house that had once been his sanctuary had become a stage for lies. But John was done being a blind audience. He would play along for now, until the moment came to bring the curtain down. The room was still, almost holy in its silence. Only the ticking of the clock and Edward's restless breath filled the air. He laid the papers on the table with a trembling hand, though his smile never faltered. "Dad, it's just one last thing. Simple. Sign here and everything will be secure. I'll handle the rest." John, slouched in his chair, let his fingers trace the edge of the pen. The familiar act of trust, so small yet so costly, hung in the air like a noose. Edward leaned closer, placing the pen firmly into his father's hand. "Go on, Dad. Just a signature." But instead of lowering his head, John lifted it. Slowly, deliberately. His eyes, clear, sharp, no longer clouded, locked onto Edward's face. For a heartbeat, Edward froze, the mask slipping. John's voice came low, steady, carrying the weight of a father's love turned into iron resolve. "You thought I couldn't see, boy? But I've been watching. Every lie. Every scheme. And I see you now." The color drained from Edward's face. His hands shook, the illusion shattered. The son who had posed as protector now stood exposed as betrayer. In that moment, the paper on the table was no longer a contract. It was the grave Edward had dug for himself. "Tell me, what would you say if you were in John's shoes, staring into the eyes of a child who betrayed you this deeply? Drop your words in the comments. I want to hear them." The silence after John's revelation cracked open like thunder. Edward stumbled backward, his face drained of color, yet his tongue moved quickly, desperate to patch a dam already broken. "Dad, you don't understand," he stammered. "I was trying to help, just to keep everything safe. Carter twisted things, not me. You know I'd never." "Enough." John's voice thundered, carrying years of patience now shattered. He rose from his chair with surprising strength, his eyes burning into the son he once trusted with everything. "I was blind in these eyes, but I wasn't blind in my spirit. I heard your lies. I felt your greed. You took the very roof I built for you, the legacy your mother cherished, and tried to sell it piece by piece. To strangers. To wolves." Edward's hand shook. His denial turned to anger. "I'm your son. You owe me this house. All my life I've lived under your shadow, waiting for you to hand it over. This was supposed to be mine." John's voice broke, but it did not soften. "Mine? No, boy. It was never yours to steal. And now it never will be. I'd rather give every brick of this house to a motherless home than leave it in your greedy hands. From this day forward, you are no son of mine." Edward froze. The words cut deeper than any blade. But instead of repentance, a seed of bitterness rooted in his chest, dark and unyielding. The air between them felt scorched, thick with the weight of words that could not be taken back. John stood tall, chest heaving, the anger of a father betrayed still crackling in his voice. Edward, however, had shifted. His panic was gone, replaced by something sharper, colder, like a cornered animal baring its teeth. "So that's it," Edward said, his voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "You're going to throw me away? Hand this house to strangers? Cast me out like trash?" John's face was unyielding. "You've made your choice, Edward. This legacy is bigger than you, bigger than me. And I will not let greed destroy it." For a moment, Edward's eyes glistened, as if regret might finally break through. But then he leaned forward, his words dripping with venom. "You think you're untouchable, old man? You think the church will keep singing your praises once they know the truth?" John stiffened, his breath catching. "What are you talking about?" Edward's smile was cruel. "Don't act like it never happened. That secret you've buried, the one you never even told me about until I dug through your old papers. If I open my mouth, Dad, your reputation, your so-called good name in this community, it all goes up in smoke. The words landed like a blade to John's heart. His mind raced, dredging up the past he had prayed would stay hidden forever. Memories he had fought to silence pressed against the walls of his chest. "You wouldn't?" John whispered, his voice raw. "Oh, I would," Edward hissed, stepping closer, his face inches from his father's. "If you cut me out, if you take away what's mine, then I'll take away what's yours, your pride, your standing, your precious image. The whole church, the whole town will know the truth you've hidden. And when they do, you won't be John the respected elder. You'll be John the hypocrite. John the liar." John's fists clenched, his body trembling. Not from weakness but from the sheer weight of betrayal. It was one thing for Edward to steal, to lie, to squander. But this was warfare with blood ties. "Edward," John said, his voice breaking between sorrow and fury, "how did we come to this? You're my son, my flesh. And you would burn me down just to warm yourself?" Edward's eyes hardened. "I learned from the best." The silence that followed was unbearable. Father and son stood locked in a standoff neither could retreat from. The house, once filled with love and faith, had become a battlefield. John turned away, his heart splintering under the weight of both the threat and the memory of the boy he once cradled in his arms. The boy was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by bitterness, willing to destroy his father to claim what he believed was rightfully his. And for the first time John understood, this fight would not stay inside these walls. It was about to spill into the world outside, where secrets cut deeper than betrayal. What do you think Edward's secret weapon is? What truth could he possibly be holding over his father? Drop your guesses in the comments because the next chapter is about to peel it wide open. John had weathered storms before. He had buried a wife, worked himself raw to build a life, and carried the weight of community expectations on his shoulders. But this storm was unlike any other. This one had a name. Edward. And though the threat of that buried secret clawed at his chest, John knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would not bend. The night Edward spat venom about destroying him, John barely slept. Instead, he sat in the stillness of his study, eyes open, mind racing. He thought back over the past weeks, the whispered calls, the papers Edward pressed under his hand, the sudden hush when Carter visited. The truth wasn't just in his memory, it was in the evidence Edward thought he had hidden from a blind man. John opened the locked drawer of his desk. From it, he pulled the quiet arsenal he had gathered during his weeks of feigned blindness. Letters with Carter's handwriting, contracts with his signature forged at the bottom, bank statements that made no sense. He had traced them with his fingertips, memorizing their feel even when his eyes could not see. Now, with sight restored, the words burned like fire. And it wasn't just papers. There were voices. Old Deacon Marcus had seen Carter slip into the house at midnight. Sister Lillian from the choir had overheard Edward bragging about big money soon to come. Even the neighbor's boy had asked why strangers were measuring John's back lot. Each witness was a puzzle piece, and together they formed a picture too damning to ignore. John knew he couldn't keep this in the shadows. Edward's betrayal had moved beyond private sin. It was poisoning the community's trust, the very church where John had spent decades serving. The matter had to be laid bare in the light. So he began to move. Quietly, carefully. He met with Elder Marcus in the church office, sliding the forged papers across the desk. Marcus's eyes widened, sorrow etching deep into his face. "Brother John," he whispered, "this is serious. Too serious to ignore." He spoke with trusted leaders, men and women who had known his family for decades. Each time he revealed another layer, the signatures, the transfers, the debts piling high. Each time their silence grew heavier. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others clenched their fists in anger. Even the bank could not be ignored. John demanded a private meeting with the regional director, bypassing Carter altogether. Sitting across the polished oak table, he laid down the documents, one by one. The director's face turned pale as the evidence mounted. "Forgery," he murmured. "Breach of trust. If this is true, Carter won't just lose his position. He'll face criminal charges." For the first time in weeks, John felt steady again. Not unbroken, never unbroken, but steady. He wasn't just a father betrayed. He was a man preparing for war. And as the circle widened, from church to community to the very bank itself, John understood that this reckoning would not be private. It would be public, raw, and unavoidable. The son he had raised to be his legacy would soon stand exposed before the very people who once praised him as a dutiful child. John closed the folder of evidence and set it on the table before him. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were firm. The time for shadows was over. The stage was set. And the reckoning was coming. The reckoning John had feared finally arrived, not in whispers but in a storm of voices. It began at a church meeting, the sanctuary packed with familiar faces. Edward stood tall, his tone sharp, his charm polished for the crowd. "My father's mind is slipping," he declared. "He doesn't know what he's signing anymore. I've been the one protecting him, keeping this house together while he declines." Murmurs rippled through the room, some shocked, some sympathetic. But then John rose. No cane, no hesitation. His eyes were clear, his voice steady. He laid the papers on the pulpit, the forged signatures, the bank statements, the contracts that bore Edward's lies. Gasps echoed through the pews. Elder Marcus confirmed what he had seen. Sister Lillian testified to what she had overheard. Piece by piece, the mask Edward had built cracked apart. The courtroom came next. Edward, flanked by a nervous Carter, doubled down on his story, calling his father delusional, accusing him of bitterness. But John's evidence spoke louder than Edward's words. The judge sifted through each document, his expression hardening. Carter's face turned pale as the fraud became undeniable. By the end, the community that once called Edward dutiful son, now whispered another word: traitor. John, standing with the weight of proof on his side, looked not triumphant but broken. This was no victory, it was survival. The son he had loved was now a public disgrace, and the house that once symbolized family had become the evidence of betrayal. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the low hum of whispered gossip. Edward lingered near the back, his jaw tight, his eyes darting with desperation. John sat at the front, his hand resting on a folded envelope that had never left his pocket since the trial began. Edward approached, his charm gone, his voice sharp with bitterness. "You think you've won? You embarrassed me in front of everyone I know. You ruined me, Dad." His tone cracked between fury and pleading. "But you can fix this. If you just transfer the house to me quietly, I'll keep your secrets buried. The community doesn't need to know everything about you, or about Mom." John's eyes narrowed. He had expected Edward to beg, to apologize, even to curse. But this threat, this manipulation, was a final line he would not allow to be crossed. "Edward," John said, standing to face him. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful, but laced with steel. "I have no secrets that would shame me more than your betrayal already has. But if you think your mother's memory is a weapon you can wield, you're gravely mistaken." Edward's breath hitched. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. John unfolded the envelope and pulled out a letter, yellowed but carefully preserved. "This," he said, holding it up, "was your mother's last letter to me before she passed. I've kept it all these years." His voice wavered, but the words carried weight. He read aloud, "Our home is more than walls, John. It is the story of our love, the inheritance of honesty we must leave for our son. Promise me, never let him trade it for greed." The words struck like a hammer. Edward's shoulders sagged, his bravado leaking away. His eyes glistened, but pride kept the tears from falling. John stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "She believed in you, Edward. She prayed you'd carry our values forward. Instead, you've tried to destroy everything she stood for. You are my son, but today I bury the idea of you as my heir. This house, this legacy will never be yours." Edward's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life he had no script, no scheme, no shield. John turned his back and handed the letter to Elder Marcus, who had witnessed the exchange in silence. "This belongs to the community now. Let it remind us all what legacy truly means." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Edward stood alone, hollow and defeated, while John walked away, not as a blind man, not as a victim, but as a father who had chosen integrity over blood. The morning sun filtered through the stained-glass windows of St. Matthew's Church, casting soft patterns of light on the polished wooden pews. The church was fuller than it had been in weeks. Word had spread that John was about to make his final decision regarding the house, the heart of his family's legacy. Neighbors, church elders, community leaders, and children from the local motherless home filled the space with a quiet anticipation. John sat near the pulpit, his cane resting against the side of the chair, though his sight had long been restored. He looked older, perhaps wearier, but there was a resolute fire in his eyes that hadn't been there since before the accident. In front of him lay a simple folder containing the deed to the house. Edward stood in the back, arms folded tightly across his chest, his head bowed but his jaw clenched. Stripped of his confident charm, he looked smaller, like a man who had gambled everything and lost. The community gave him glances, some filled with pity, others with disdain, but no one offered him a seat. He had made himself a stranger in the place where his father was most respected. Elder Marcus opened the gathering with prayer, his words laced with gravity. Lord, grant us wisdom in this moment. Let the choices made here honor truth, justice, and the memory of those who came before. When it was John's turn, he rose slowly, leaning heavily on the cane. His voice, though soft, carried through the sanctuary with the weight of conviction. This house, he began, pausing to steady his breath, is not just brick and stone. It is the blood, sweat, and tears of a life shared with my late wife. It was meant to be my gift to the next generation, a foundation upon which legacy could be built. But legacy is not only about land. It is about values, about honesty, about love. He glanced at Edward, who avoided his eyes, staring at the floor. The silence stretched, pressing heavily on everyone present. For weeks, John continued, I pretended to be blind. And in that blindness I saw more than I ever did with clear sight. I saw greed. I saw betrayal. And I saw how a son can choose to dishonor the very roots that raised him. His words cut sharply, but there was no malice, only sorrow. He opened the folder and lifted the deed. This house will not pass into hands that would sell it for selfish gain. Instead, it will serve those who have no roof, no parents, no inheritance. I hereby sign it over to St. Matthew's motherless home, that it may shelter children and remind them that they, too, are heirs to dignity and love. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The children from the home, wide-eyed, looked at one another as though they had been handed a miracle. Elder Marcus stepped forward, tears brimming in his eyes, and placed a hand on John's shoulder. You've not only given them a house, Marcus said, his voice trembling. You've given them hope. You've restored what betrayal tried to destroy. Edward finally lifted his head. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. The shame was visible in every muscle of his face. He turned and walked out of the church, the doors closing behind him with a hollow echo that seemed to mark the end of something final. John lowered himself back into the chair, his chest heavy but his spirit lighter. He had reclaimed the legacy, not by keeping it within bloodlines, but by ensuring it carried meaning beyond his years. Later, as the community gathered around him, offering thanks and admiration, John slipped away to sit alone by the churchyard oak tree. He touched the letter from his late wife, folded neatly in his pocket. Mary, he whispered, gazing upward. I did as you asked. The house will stand not as a monument to wealth, but as a testimony of love and truth. Our son may have lost his way, but your words guided me home. A single tear slid down his cheek, not of regret, but of release. He knew he had paid the price of protecting his legacy. Trust once broken could not be mended in a day, but in giving the house away, he had safeguarded the values his wife had cherished. The bells of St. Matthew's rang out, their sound filling the air like a promise that life, though marred by betrayal, could still be reclaimed by acts of courage and grace. If you were in John's shoes, would you have given the house away, or still left a portion for Edward despite his betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below.